Thanks for joining me, and thanks for getting together to talk about SLC and you. With that, why don't you just tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, good morning, Adrian, and thank you for the invite. So I guess my IT career goes back to 1984 when I started working for IBM. I had about 13 years working in a technical marketing role. Um, yeah, Initially working with a number of UK banking clients, including Midland Bank, who I later went on to join. Now, I had a spell working with a brewer, which was always interesting. But
Which brewer was it?
it was Bass, who
Oh,
were
okay.
at the time were the largest hotel owner in the world, strangely enough, because
Oh,
they owned Holiday Inns.
didn't know that.
So it's a little known fact, yes.
Hmm.
But I left IBM in '98 and joined Midland Bank as it was just transitioning in to be branded HSBC. I'd known a lot of people there from working with them inside IBM. So I worked for HSBC for about 17 years, almost 18 years. And I did a variety of roles there, but all managerial and running. I ran a department for quite a long time. I ran a department that was dealing with all of the middleware and database technology, and that was supporting a wide range of systems across corporate banking, global banking, markets, commercial retail, internal systems. It was quite a wide, broad, broad church, I suppose you'd say. So I ended up with a good appreciation of all of the infrastructure from both IBM and my time in HSBC. In the last couple of years I was at HSBC, I led some critical service reviews in about 6 countries, looking at the infrastructure and systems that were supporting the most critical business services. So, the end-to-end architecture, looking after ATM systems or card or domestic payments, international payments, and so on. That was really interesting. And it plays to my strengths. I'm kind of very much interested in operational risk and resilience. And for the last 9 years, I've acted as an independent consultant and doing some of that work, reviewing people's disaster recovery planning and things like that. So I'd say my focus on my area of strength is looking at that. Where are the operational risks and issues that could impact the running of your systems, and what do you do to mediate and mitigate against that?
Absolutely. Great. That's great. Thanks. And so I'll give a little bit of my background. So similar to you, though not on the technology side, I spent, 20 some odd, 24, 25 years in financial services. I started off after 10 years in the military and joined what was then Household International, and a consumer finance company, and worked within the operations and technology, financial planning and analysis component before heading off to the bank card business, and spent about almost 10 years in the card business doing a whole host of things. We were acquired in 2003 by HSBC. And so shortly, a couple years after we were acquired, I thought that it would be good to go actually get involved in the retail bank. And so I moved to Buffalo and was involved in a whole host of activities across the retail bank, everything from student lending to operational risk. And actually started the first business risk and control function in all of HSBC, which was for the US personal banking wealth management team. Did that for a number of years, had a brief hiatus, came back, continued to do that, but also managed, P&Ls, and ended my career with HSBC as the head of the payments transaction, banking payments. And so I'm familiar with all the products across the retail banking space and small business lending. I likewise left and went to work as a consultant in the industry, did a number of things there. I was persuaded in 2022 to join Citi as the chief risk officer for the U.S. retail bank, and I did that up until January of this year when I left. And shortly after, I was contacted by Travis and joined SLC as the head of product. And so exciting to have joined this venture and looking forward to working with folks like you and making this thing grow and be whatever. So having said that, I'll kind of shift gears and start talking about you and kind of your perceptions around SLC. And I'd be interested to know what caught your interest in SLC. Many investors I talked to realize that non face to face fraud was 3.1 trillion in 2023, and over the last year around 20, the last 5 years around 20, and that this sets the stage for the problem in the banking financial crisis in the world, some of which we've seen, and some of the ongoing challenges. And so just kind of would like to get your perspective on all of that.
Yeah, I was approached by a former colleague who was aware of what SLC was doing and was and asked me if I would be interested in investing. And I was at the time I was very open to more of a risk reward sort of investment, shall we say, rather than just having money in the savings account. And when we talked about it, so this was somebody that I'd known much earlier in my career, and we were still connected, and it was somebody that I very much trusted, and I thought had a very, very good judgment, very good business judgment. So I was very prepared to listen to what he was saying, and he explained what SLC was doing. And for me, I guess I go back to talking about joining HSBC. Well, one of my early roles I was involved in, I had the team that was putting in part of the infrastructure for TV banking and UK internet banking and Jersey internet banking in Sheffield in the UK. And I sort of thinking about how that evolved over time and looking at the security around systems. You're starting at the very, very bricks and mortar level. You have a data center and you have certain security about who can actually go in and out physically. And then you move into the infrastructure, and there's been a huge amount of effort put into tightening up infrastructures to prevent malicious hacking attempts. So systems infrastructure, systems security, network, preventing malware and so on. We're all familiar with all of that. And that prevents people hacking in. Then you get to the level where you have user access into systems. So the hacking can either disrupt by things like denial of service attacks, or a hacker could get in and steal the data. The other piece, when you get out to the user side of things, becomes, okay, you've got a user ID and a password. And how has that grown over the years? Because more and more people have eaten away at fraudulent use of somebody's password and passcodes. So how much effort is made at preventing misuse of a legitimate user logon? And we then move into having a user ID and a passcode, and I guess people will be familiar with these things. The we had physical little key fobs and the dongles to put a new passcode in, a randomly generated passcode. So there's a second layer of authentication there. And that moved, of course, into the mobile banking apps that we now have, and we can do it on our telephone. But we also see things like, so if I do a transaction, I might get asked to verify that, and I get a one-time passcode from my bank to put in when I'm making an online purchase. What it might also do is ask me to type in my email address. So these advances are all gearing up at really how do they try to make sure that it is really me using my credentials? And that's quite a different problem, I suppose, to the wider hacking and infrastructural malicious attacks. So the last bit there, the bit about entering my email ID, I thought, that's interesting, because as I type that, it's obviously the phone must be doing something to register how I type my email address in. And so I come back to that's the sort of, I think that's the evolution over the last 24 years. So, and what my friend was explaining to me about what SLC was doing was this. SLC are not looking to do a little step change, because those things have been small step changes over the last 24 years. And it's been quite slow. What SLC struck me they were doing was a major extension to that level of user authentication, and really putting in not one step change, but probably 10 or 15 step changes in a very short space of time. Now that is really quite significant. So that's what really got me. And I thought, okay, I went ahead and invested, and I've actually, since investing, having had more talks with members of the team and more conversations with a friend of mine who's quite involved, I've just become, this doesn't seem like a very high risk investment for me. It seems like a bit of a no brainer, because this just seems like it will be a massive change to making sure that whoever it is using that legitimate entry into the system is actually the person who should be making legitimate entry into the system.
Absolutely. So, my first conversation with Travis when he contacted me, about joining SLC or participating in SLC as a advisor. He described to me what it was that they had developed, and in particular, a specific use case. Combining this with other things. I kind of stopped him as he was describing the SIM based technology. And I said, wait, are you telling me that you can positively identify that the phone in that person's hand is in the person who's the customer? And he said, yeah. And I was like, that's it, I'm sold. Right. And because in particular, in my last job, we were dealing with, the evolution that has taken place because of mobile banking in the fraud space, and in particular with identity theft and synthetic identity. And so I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but in the US over the last probably 12 to 18 months, there's been a flurry of activity from the regulators, aimed primarily at small community banks that are partners with fintechs. And much of that criticism that has taken place is about a lack of robust KYC, AML, and as kind of information comes to light on what was going on, it is the fact that many of the accounts that are established at these banks through these partnerships are either for folks who aren't who they say they are, or who are, but are, executing, transactions and banking, basically laundering proceeds of money through illicit means. And so, I'd be interested to kind of get your perspective on that component of it, outside of the authentication of existing customers, kind of how to deal with this, and how you see maybe SLC plays within that space.
Yeah, I think the auditors, regulators, the regulatory bodies have got such a lot of got a lot of tools in that, haven't they? And if you are directed by regulators deal with stuff like that, you really got to get and address it. I think, interestingly, I guess, how do you block or identify that fraudulent people are trying to set up new accounts is quite a difficult one. But ultimately, there has to be something that you hook into, and quite often that will be a telephone number, an address, and so on. So somewhere in there has to be presumably some reference to a telephone. And how, if you've got something that can really understand what that telephone is, how it's personalized to the individual, then that's got to be a big bonus in preventing a financial organization falling into that trap and handing out those sort of new IDs to people who aren't really who they say they are. And I guess that comes down to the SIM itself. And if you had an ability to go off to a third party to really check that person was the person who would be tied to that SIM, and their behaviors with that phone were correct, that's got to be a big prevention opportunity.
Absolutely. I mean, as I tell Travis and others on the the executive team often, right? I tell them, I said, this is the silver bullet, right? This ability to do that is a silver bullet, and it has applications beyond. Other things that we deal with from a fraud perspective within financial services are related to a whole host of things like SIM swapping, number spoofing, man in the middle attacks, things like that. You mentioned one-time passwords, that's extremely subject to man in the middle attacks and things like that. And this in itself addresses all of those things because you can tell, right? If a device had been registered with you and you have history of how the device performs, when somebody calls in and you can query it and say, this isn't the device and it's not where the person normally is, and it's not being managed, i.e., literally physically managed. You mentioned typing in the thing, the keystrokes, the way it's held, all of that stuff does not match the customer that we onboarded and had registered on this. Then it has the potential to prevent a significant amount of fraud that's taking place. So yeah, absolutely, I think you hit it spot on.
I think it's quite a big handshake there as well between the financial organizations and the telcos.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's a lot of what we're talking about now. So one of the things that kind of brings this up is I'd like to get your perspective. As we're talking about this kind of SIM based mobile solution, and oh by the way, similar SIM or chip solutions exist on other devices. So in theory, this could be applied as well. But talking about doing KYC or authentication within that environment versus what exists today, which tends to be either historically what you were involved in, data centers and stuff like that, but now more increasingly the cloud. Is to get your perspective on how this mobile SIM kind of technology would be better than the existing cloud, and to a certain extent also the existing authentication and methodologies used today tend to be dependent on operating system, i.e. Apple, Android with Google, or others. So just like to get your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, I think some of it comes back a little bit. So I suppose it extends what I was talking about earlier in that those layers of security, the layers of the application, the layer from data center to hardware to operating system and so on. The further you go out towards the individual, the more chance you have, I think, of really understanding whether you've actually got the true individual or not. And the closest you can get is I suppose, the telephone itself, the mobile phone. And ultimately, the one thing in there that is the most secure element of that is the SIM. And if you can record a lot more of the characteristics of that user inside the SIM, it's almost like an invisible recording of who that individual is and what their traits are. So we mentioned earlier about the typing the email ID in, but there are, what I understand of SLC is development. SLC will be looking at a lot more of the characteristics that can be monitored and logged by the SIM. So getting to the SIM, which is, I suppose, non-hackable, and having that wealth of information about what that individual is, you're not going to get that in a cloud system, because in the cloud, it's just the same as what would be in a data center. I mean, having a system in the cloud, it's just in a different data center. It might not be yours. It might be operated by someone else's.
Yeah.
But ultimately, your limitations there are back to those system-wide and operating system security aspects. I think, as you mentioned there, that when you get out to the telephone, that telephone could have a different operating system on, depending on whether it's iPhone or Android or whatever. And the SIM is agnostic of that. It's independent, I guess, of the operating system. So it becomes probably the purest piece of technology you could get that sort of information from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you hit the button on the head when you talked about the SIM and kind of the immutability of the silicon. It is a secure execution environment. It's highly controlled. People can't access it. To break it, to crack it would take, computing resources that, quite frankly, you know, crooks and fraudsters aren't going to invest, right? Because they look for the path of least resistance, which is the
There's a
current
lot more
environment
low-hanging fruit.
with all these holes in it, right? Where it's easy to, spoof numbers, swap SIMs, smishing, phishing, take over people's accounts and just execute this stuff. And I think, as we've talked about, moving to this secure execution environment embodied in this SIM for both execution and, as we explore other options, is actually running potentially other platforms on that environment, right? That are now being done in the cloud, i.e., distributed ledger, smart contract stuff that can happen in that environment, and not be entirely secure, and then have the immutability of the blockchain itself behind it. So I think that just opens a lot. So, kind of touching on one last subject is, based on your experience in particular, kind of being in the middle of the architecture around data within large financial institutions, is kind of, question of, with the movement to the cloud and with existing pieces, do financial institutions kind of trust their data as it exists today?
Mm. I think that's a difficult one to answer, because if you ask them, they'd probably say yes, they do, because they've taken the decision to put that data in the cloud. So they'd be foolish to say they didn't trust it. But really, under the covers, I think you're always going to be a little. You're always going to have to take a great deal of scrutiny over how secure your data is. And in the end, whether the data is more secure in the cloud or more secure in your data center really comes down to how much security you've got in the infrastructure around it. I think that goes a lot down to the infrastructural security, that when you put stuff in the cloud, I've seen so many people, so many organizations go to cloud-based systems, and they pretty much hand over the responsibilities, and they abscond from taking on any responsibility themselves. And perhaps not so much in the financial industry, but I'm talking wider now. There are smaller organizations in particular deploy cloud hosted systems, and they then run in the belief that everything is okay because this other organization is looking after them for me. And I think that is a big mistake. You have to really get into understanding and challenging how that third party is managing that data and managing that system for you. So I think that can be a big gotcha for companies, whether they're banks or any other organization. I think with banks and financial organizations in general, the security you've got to deploy, you're talking about people's money. And when anything happens with a banking system, you're on the news. You know, if something happened with Jaguar Land Rover in their production facility and their IT systems went down, probably wouldn't make the news because it doesn't really affect the public. It would affect Jaguar Land Rover internally. They might have a couple of days of lost production. Who knows anything about it? But you have a system that goes down that affects British Airways and Heathrow, and you've got passengers queuing. You have a system that affects the banks, and you can't pay the till when you're doing your weekly shopping. That makes the news. So I think financial organizations really have to really have to scrutinize the people, the organizations who are running that data for them in the cloud, and the division of responsibilities, but most importantly, what layers of security have got wrapped around that. And I think most of that comes back to the infrastructural operating system sort of security, rather than it's more at that layer inside the data center than necessarily at the application logical user security.
Absolutely. And I'll make 2 points, right? One, there's a current crisis in the US within the fintech world around banking as a service, and in particular, the bankruptcy of Synapse. And interesting because it raises a couple points, which is you have both Synapse, their partner banks, and whoever that were operating this environment in a cloud, and reliant on a third party provider for the database management, which was MongoDB. And when Synapse went bankrupt, the biggest issue that's being worked out beyond just the technical aspects of their bankruptcy as a company is, where are the customers' funds for the underlying fintechs? And part of the problem is that the banks can't reconcile. MongoDB had or has the data, right? Synapse is gone as an entity. And so you're left with this thing where it's taking months and months and months to reconcile accounts, to understand, is the money there? And in the meantime, people's funds are frozen. Somebody just submitted to the bankruptcy court, a collection of their personal experience plus a collection of, I think it was 99 other customers who were suffering from all of this, right? And the answer is two of the banks involved, which control a significant amount of the funds, are saying it's going to take weeks to more months before they can sort this out. So yeah, that dependency in that cloud environment, to your point, if it's not carefully managed and if you're not maintaining responsibility for those things, can cause significant problems and headline news.
Also, I think if you have a third party, an IT vendor like that, a software database vendor, who that could have, it wouldn't have made a great deal of difference perhaps if that was on premise or in the cloud, because ultimately the thing that's gone wrong is the database vendor underneath. You might have more access to understand it if you've got it on your own premise, because you might find it easier to troubleshoot and dig into it. But both of those are difficult to solve with a system security sort of hat on.
And the second point that I wanted to make, because as you were talking about it, is this environment and and the kind of the challenges around it. I recently was reading an article, or not an article, actually, a post on LinkedIn from a guy who had just returned from a cybersecurity conference, which was focused on AI. And his takeaway was he was scared as hell because nobody knows how to secure AI. And it took 20 some odd years to figure out how to solve SQL in the web-based environment, right? And SQL injections and the threat from that. And AI doesn't have any or limited protections today. So you have the ability of somebody to not necessarily impact the data that you have and are maintaining, but the use of that data, because they could potentially inject into an AI machine to do something, right, that you didn't intend, and there are no protections. So we're going into an environment, everybody's touting AI and the applicability of it and the upsides of it. And we're going into an environment where actually the risks are potentially higher for certain types of activities, not necessarily the same kind of risks, but different risks. And so it's just an interesting point in time that we find ourselves with trying to figure this out. And hopefully we at SLC can help some of this and help figure out some of this. And thank you for joining me. Appreciated the conversation, and look forward to continuing the
Yeah.
dialogue of all of this.
No, thank you, Adrian.